Let's get started. It's already top of the hour at 12:02. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeff Wong from eXp Realty, your 2023 Education Committee Chair, and also your Secretary this year, serving on the Board of Directors. Some quick housekeeping items before we get started. Virtual participants will be muted in the meeting. We encourage everyone to please enter any questions you have into the chat box. The speaker will answer your questions during the Q&A toward the end. This session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, West San Gabriel Valley Realtors. Our co-host today is the lovely Pauline Lam, who will introduce our topic and guest speaker. Take it away, Pauline.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing? The Zoom people come back to board. Okay, we're so happy here. Good morning, everyone. It's my great honor to introduce our special speaker the second time to give us a commercial update and an entrance for commercial business. Attorney David Fu. David is a real estate lawyer and the principal of David Fu and Associate. And he's a full attorney real estate and business law firm located in Arcadia. He assists and advises clients concerning the real estate general business transactions and litigation and estate planning. Before David practicing law, he was a commercial investment real estate broker and in both conventional and sealed bid auction sales format. David is a frequent speaker, not only with West San Gabriel Realtors and a lot of nonprofit organizations, and including in the state bar. In 2018, he was honored as the Attorney of the Year by the small firm and solo section of the California Lawyers Association. And in 2021, David was appointed as a lawyer member of the Judicial Council, where he currently serves. Let's give a very, very warm welcome to our special guest, Mr. David Fu.
Nice to see you again. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody out there in virtual world. Some of my good friends are here too. Thank you very much. Nice to see you all again. And I think you all know I like to move around, which makes the camera a little bit nutty, but I'm going to move out here in front. Hopefully I'll have a little box that I can move around in. So thank you very much for being here again today. You might recall when last we met, we talked about the basics of real estate investments and specifically about apartment buildings. Today, we're going to be talking about instead what I call lease investments, which are investment real estate properties that typically involve leases. So let's get right into it. Some of this presentation you'll find is similar. But because we're going to go through the initial part, which restates some of the things, and it's always important to, I think, repeat those things anyway, so that you have some good idea of what we talked about the last time, and it's a good introduction. So today, we're going to be talking again about a basic overview of investment. We had divided that talk into two talks, apartments and lease investments. The last time we dealt with apartments, this time we're going to be talking about lease investments. We'll start with an initial review, as I said a moment ago, of things that we did talk about the last time. I wanted to remind you today that although some of you are my clients, today you're not my clients for purposes of this talk. And so we're not forming an attorney-client relationship. We're not giving you any tax or legal advice. And the purpose of this talk is really for informational purposes only. And let's see, is this thing working?
Is it? I think so. I lifted up. Okay.
Is that me operating or is that you?
You.
Okay. I'll take your word for it.
Does it go? Oh, okay. Maybe a little
Okay,
slower.
so first we're talking about some things that I want you to watch out for. Lawyers have a fancy word for that. We call them caveats. That means, okay, watch out for this, or it's a caution. So the first thing is about that, and we talked about this the last time, is that to watch out for valuation issues. Today, we're going to be talking about valuation issues because they're important to understand when you're going to broker an investment deal. But I don't want you per se to perform quote unquote valuations and certainly not appraisals unless you're a licensed appraiser. And I think this is just a placebo. So,
Oh, my God.
sorry, I have problems with that clicker here. So therefore, don't perform valuations for clients unless you're a licensed appraiser. What would be a good idea for you to do would be to remember that awkward questions could come up. Are you actually qualified to perform a valuation? That is not an easy question to answer. And I think that where you don't want to be is to find yourself in a place at some point where someone's accused you of doing something you weren't qualified to. It's also not going to be covered under your E&O policy. And that's an important thing to remember because E&O is important. So you don't want to do things that will jeopardize that coverage. You can't talk with your client about some concepts in valuation, how it works. You can talk with them about what, given a certain set of assumptions, what you believe that the market would state about what this property is worth. But I want you to be careful about not crossing over that line and actually performing a quote valuation for somebody. That comparative market analysis that every real estate agent learns to do in a residential setting is not called a valuation. It's not called an appraisal. Okay? Remember that. And so there's a reason why the CMA is the language of our process. We don't want you to get into trouble doing something that's beyond your ability, or at least accused of that. Is this me on delay?
I don't know.
So you're not
hoping-
me, right? That's me, right?
Yeah.
So then I am working on delay. It's like the way my brain works now. Okay.
If
So,
not, just let
you
me know
know-
next slide and next, and I'll click. If
No, I mean, I
Okay.
think if I'm working, right? I'm just working slowly. And for anybody who's getting old like me, you know what that means. So I'll just bear that in mind and I'll keep working away at this thing. So what's useful, I think, too, and we're doing this kind of talk, is to tell people what you're not going to talk about. So we just talked about what we are going to talk about, but now let's talk about what we're not going to. Presentation pop up. Keep talking.
it's not okay, I'll help it along.
Yeah, you can just populate that slide then too long. It's okay. So we're not going to be talking really about title issues or title vesting, entities and entity selection. Those are important issues when you're talking about investments in commercial real estate. We won't be discussing taxation. We aren't going to be talking about escrow and broker liability, except to the extent that I kind of touch on those issues to say, hey, don't do this or watch out for these things. We won't be talking about the disclosure duties of buyers and sellers in transactions or for brokers. And we won't be talking about valuation based on the cost approach, because I find that to be, although it's part of every appraisal, it's actually not very productive, not very useful really in Southern California, because we just don't, those numbers do not really coincide with what the actual values of those assets are. So, and why don't you go ahead on to the next one.
Okay.
Thank you. So the other thing I want to tell you is that some of the things I'm going to tell you are sort of my observations. The world of investment real estate is a very large one, and people look at things very differently. So there are different ways to evaluate an investment. There are different ways to talk about those things. And so what I'm saying this is that what we're trying to do is give you some nuts and bolts information. And that, but it's, if you find that somebody else is describing it in a different way, don't complain to me. It's just that they happen to do it different. Let's move on to the next one. The other thing that as I said the last time, is we're going to talk about things which are pretty mainstream. They're almost anything that you buy for investment is therefore investment real estate. A lot of people invest in single family homes. Are they investment real estate? Well, I suppose technically they're real estate investments, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about things that people traditionally view as investment real estate, specifically office buildings, retail shopping centers, and things of that nature when we're talking about the lease investment world. Okay, we won't dive into superficial or sort of obscure topics because there's so much to talk about already. It wouldn't be able, or we wouldn't be able to cover everything. We're going to kind of go off into other tangents. Okay. Next slide, please. So, and let's go ahead and just populate this. Thank you very much. So again, a commercial transaction is really not that different from a residential transaction. It involves a seller, there's a listing process, or there might be an unsolicited offer. A buyer is located, that's with or without the services of a broker. An escrow is typically appointed, a title company is selected to ensure title. Now, there's a lender if there is financing involved in that transaction, and then there's an escrow closing. Let's go to the next. So what's different? The difference in investment real estate is that there's typically a great deal more what I call third-party involvement. Other than the buyer, other than the seller, there are other people that we need to talk to, or we need to collect information from, or that we require some cooperation. The other thing is that investments are much more varied than single-family homes, and therefore there is less standardization, quote unquote, of the documents that relate to them, such as loan documents and so on. You know, with a single-family home market, of course, most loans are packaged and sold as securities, and you only have somebody who's like a loan originator. There's very little portfolio maintenance of a loan nowadays with a single family home transaction. On the other hand, for commercial lending, for local banks that are making those loans and that kind of thing, it is far more common for that loan to be maintained and portfolioed by the lender. So there's a difference in terms of how much control they have, how much variation there is to those documents, how much you can negotiate the controlling documents. The other thing that's different about a commercial transaction is that there are more contractual relationships that need to be addressed. You have tenants, which are the basis for the income for the property, and each one of those tenants typically has a lease, and that lease dictates the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So the ability for a new buyer to purchase that property and increase the rents, or the increases that will come naturally as a result of the passage of time, ordinary escalations which are built into that lease, those are things which are addressed in a commercial lease, but we don't see those in, let's say, an apartment building or in the lease for a single family home. Normally, if you rent a home to a tenant, let's say it's a single family home, you say, okay, the rent is $1,000, you've got a lease for a year. And that's pretty much all that lease is going to say. It doesn't say after that, we're going to have a COLA adjustment, it will be cost of living, according to the LA Long Beach greater, municipal area, that it will be arranged from 3 to 5%. If we can't reach an agreement, we'll each appoint an appraiser, and then the appraisers will get together and do a valuation to determine what the rent escalation will be. And if those two appraisers can't agree, then they will appoint a third appraiser who will make a decision which is binding. I mean, those are the kinds of things you can have in a commercial lease, but you're very unlikely to have that in a residential lease, right? After a year, you're going to go month to month. If you don't like them, you're going to give a 60-day notice to try to get rid of them. That's a very complicated thing these days, but it could happen. And you might have rent control, which might limit your ability to increase the rent. But other than that, you're just going to see what happens. You know, I own single family home investments, and what I try to do is I try not to raise the rent at all, because if they're good tenants, I want them to stay forever. Just get out of my way. Don't call me for anything, and be nice people. And so that's a management style question. You know, is it important to me to keep increasing that rent and to manipulate or negotiate that with my tenant? You don't have that in a commercial lease. In a commercial lease, either the rent is going to be flat for the duration of that lease, or it's going to state what the bumps are going to be or what the procedure is for setting those escalations. So there's a lot more going on in that relationship that has to be addressed in a commercial transaction, because you have to analyze, somebody has to analyze that tenant lease as part of the due diligence process. Also, with commercial buildings, you are far more likely to have some kind of easement or other non-possessory right, which is a legal right in that land, which describes the relationship of that land to an adjacent landowner. We know with single-family homes, it's very common to have a utility easement. Southern California Edison can come onto the property and do something. They have the ability to locate a pole at the back of the property, and they have the right to maintain that property. They might be able to, or there might be a cable company which has underground lines on the property. We know that those things are okay for residential. We generally ignore them, right? They're really generally not an issue. However, in a commercial property, they might be very important. Is there an easement for ingress and egress, coming and going on the property? Do people cross your property to enter another property? Do you have the right to change that or to eliminate that ingress, egress, or to somehow change the locations of the driveways and so forth? All of those things are important to know about because they're not all drafted the same, and they need to be reviewed because they affect the ownership experience of your buyer. There may also be soils contamination issues, which is far more common in a commercial setting than there is in a residential setting. Typically, if you have, again, a single family home, certainly a condominium or something like that, it's probably adjoined by other single family homes. The likelihood that there is a dirty process next door is kind of remote. Sure, there could be a gas station across the street that has an oil leak, an underground storage tank, a UST problem where that tank is leaking. It causes what the environmental people call a plume, which is released, and that can migrate to the properties across the street. That could happen, but it doesn't happen very often because, of course, very few people, and all my friends out there in cyberland, you probably don't live next door to a gas station, right? Or for that matter, across the street. You could, but it's not very likely because the way that zoning works and the way we try to organize our real estate in Southern California, it's very unusual, but not very unusual. It is less likely that you have a residential use immediately adjacent to that kind of commercial use. So it's not that big of a problem. On the other hand, very commonly, you have a commercial use, which is either converted from a prior industrial use or adjacent to an industrial use. We know because we've lived out in this part of the county for a while. There are places, let's say like Chino or the Chino Hills, which used to be all agricultural or manufacturing. They used to, I think there was a brick kiln or something like that in the Chino Hills. I know there was a giant dairy ranch out there that you could smell for miles and miles, right? Well, it's gone now, and it's now a giant shopping center. So those things tell you that we have that kind of change of use, which can provide for or allow you to run into issues where there are contamination issues for that soil, which weren't addressed before or are continuing to be addressed now. So all of these things tell you that you have heightened due diligence requirements or needs in a commercial transaction that you don't really have in a residential transaction. And that requires the need for more counsel and more care. Next slide, please. Thank you. And why don't we go ahead and populate this? So as we talked about the last time, we separated the world out into apartments and basically leased investments. Okay. And by apartments, we talked about anything that was really operating on a basis without a long-term lease. So, we had pointed out that there are other types of sort of apartment style investments, like let's say a self-storage facility. That's where people come and rent a small, like garage size space, and they pay a certain amount of money per month, and they can come and go as they please. And if they stop paying it, their tenancy basically ends. And they move on, they go somewhere else and take their stuff and go somewhere else. Okay. And mini storage is a storage facility that allows you to store your mobile home or RV or something like that on that property. Motels and hotels, of course, are not typically long-term tenancy. although they can be. And then, of course, apartment buildings, which are typically no longer than a 1-year lease agreement. And most of them are probably month to month. So a leased investment is different. There's a lease, and that lease is the basis for evaluating the income stream that it represents. And therefore, the integrity of that lease, the credit worthiness of the tenant, the duties of the landlord to that tenant, the powers that the landlord has over the tenant, the late rent provisions, the forfeiture provisions, the tenant's rights to close completely or shut down for some period of time. All of those things are dictated under that lease, and they're important to the landlord. So it's very different because basically, when you buy something like a shopping center, you're really buying a bunch of promises. You're buying a bunch of promises to pay so much money over time. That retail space itself often has very little in the way of intrinsic value other than the dirt itself. It's a space, it's a shell. Okay. Some have, extensive interior improvements, tenant improvements that make that property more valuable. But very often the tenant improvements in that space only benefit this tenant. And if somebody else moves into it, they may not need it at all. Okay, so really what you're looking at is, again, that piece of paper, that promise to pay, how creditworthy that tenant is, which will dictate to you how much jeopardy there is to the landlord in assuming that the tenant will pay that rent over time. Because the landlord will purchase that property as the buyer based on the income stream and a discounted evaluation of that income stream. So if the income stream just doesn't happen, you overpay for the property, right? Let's go on to the next slide. A brief digression here is a discussion again about sort of the difference between residential and commercial. But it's true generally about real estate. Generally about real estate, if you're buying something which is relatively, I'll call it not inexpensive, that's the wrong way to look at it, because there's no such thing as inexpensive real estate in Southern California. But I'm talking about a smaller purchase. So let's say you're buying a single family home for $600,000, if such a thing still exists. Okay. It's not like you're going to go to, I don't even know who the residential lenders are. I'll use Flagstar because I know that. And say, I'm going to negotiate the points I'm going to pay. No, I won't give you a half a point. I'll give you, $300 instead. Well, they're like going to say, go away, shove off. I don't know, but our fees are our fees. But on the other hand, if you're buying, a $20 million office building, and you're borrowing money from a life company, a life insurance company that invests in these types of financing, and they tell you that, we're going to charge you these due diligence fees, and we're going to charge, so many points. Well, that is negotiable because it's a business transaction. It's done with a sophisticated buyer, somebody who has a substantial amount of money. It's more negotiable than, let's say, that single family transactions. I'm not saying that, the life insurance company is going to come and kowtow to you and just beg you to do that deal. Sometimes we are in that place. Thankfully, we're not there today. That does happen sometimes when the real estate economy has gone straight to hell and everybody's terrified. But under normal circumstances, you have some greater ability to negotiate the terms of that, let's say that finance. Certainly when you're dealing with the broker, if you're buying a single family home and you say, hey, I want a kickback. Hopefully the broker is saying, no, I'm not going to do that because, I've worked for this money, it's mine. If on the other hand, you're doing a large transaction and you stand to earn a $500,000 fee, you're much more likely to give some thought to some accommodation to your client if your client requests it. Okay. Again, it's because the nature of the theory of the investment pyramid is at work here. That it's lonely at the top, but you get to dictate the terms much more often. Okay. And so this is a thought just to offer to you because it does come up more often in a commercial real estate investment setting than it does in a residential transaction. Next slide, please. So again, a little while ago, we talked about this idea of the discounted income stream. So a lease investment is basically sold as a discounted income stream. What do we mean by that? Well, we think of it as a lot like a bond, that you're going to receive a certain amount of income over a certain period of time. And that based on the income that you receive from that investment, you're going to agree to pay a price, which represents a calculation of what that entire income stream is over a certain period of time, discounted to a net present value basis today. So if you're going to buy, again, a shopping center that you believe over the next 30 years is going to pay you $1 million per year, then we're going to apply some kind of factor, probably a capitalization rate, to what you think that income stream is going to be, and say, based on that income stream, I'm willing to pay this much. Okay, and so that's where that number comes in, is that if your net operating income was $1 million, we would apply a capitalization rate to it in order to derive a current price. If it was 5%, it would be about $20 million. So, and typically we're going to use the capitalization rate. It's the most sort of generally accepted or widely accepted sort of shortcut to perform that quick and dirty valuation. And that's often abbreviated to a cap rate. The cap rate provides what you think of as a constant measure for return, and it controls out the cost of borrowing. So the difference is when you look at different types of valuation methodologies, you will see that sometimes they're based on what the actual cost is to borrow for that investment. Okay, that is a calculation which is based typically on what's called cash on cash return, because that will be affected by how much you're paying for finance. With a capitalization rate, we're only talking about what the return to an investor would be before taxes and debt service. And what that does is it allows us to standardize the theory of that return, because if it would be affected by whether you're borrowing money to buy that investment, therefore using leverage to buy that investment, as opposed to paying all cash, that doesn't give you a kind of apples to apples comparison. I mean, if I'm going to buy that $10 million apartment building and if I'm going to use that, buy that $10 million shopping center and put $3 million down, but you're going to buy that $10 million shopping center and pay all cash. Why do we care that one of us is buying it with leverage and one of us is buying it with all cash? It should not matter when we're just trying to determine in an objective world, what is the value of this thing? And the capitalization rate allows us to do that because we're only thinking about how much money does it generate, not whether or not interest rates are high or low, or if I'm paying any interest at all. Okay. Sometimes something is called the, which is used, is called the IRR, the internal rate of return, which is a more sophisticated method to perform evaluation of that investment. It takes into account the changing cash flows which occur over a period of time on a month-to-month basis. And that allows us to take into account the fact that the lease might provide for rent escalations. So let's say you have a large shopping center. One tenant adjusts rent every year. Another tenant has an adjustment every 3 years. Another tenant is flat for 5 years, but after 5 years, we'll get a COLA adjustment where you get a catch-up adjustment that takes back into account all of what would have been the escalations over that 5-year period. So, how do you evaluate that? By using the internal rate of return, you're able to take into consideration all those different cash flow calculations to establish what the value is. The disadvantage of the capitalization rate is it's a snapshot today. You don't care that rents are going to go up tomorrow. You don't care that rents will go up in some places every year and other places every 3 years. It's just saying today, or at this moment in time, this is what the capitalization, or this is the value based on a given capitalization. You're not totally confused right now. I'm going to be shocked. Let's go to the next slide, please. If you think about it a little bit more, it will make more sense to you. Okay, and let me just dwell on it for a moment, because I think it's important. The reason why the capitalization rate, again, is a snapshot in time is because you're only talking about figuring out what the income is at that moment. It doesn't have to be today. It could be last year. It could be a year from now. It could be 3 months from now. You're picking the time, but you're not taking into account taking all those different moments in time and calculating them together. So let's go back to the capitalization rate. The capitalization rate is a very simple number to derive, although sometimes the devil is in the details. First, you have to find the net operating income. You take the net operating income, you divide that by the price, which could be the value that you're proposing, the value you're actually buying, or a target value. It's up to you. Whatever you're trying to accomplish, you will set that number. You divide the NOI, the net operating income, by the price, and you derive the cap rate. And then you just manipulate that formula to derive the other numbers. You could take the cap rate and multiply it times the price, and you'll get the NOI. You can take the NOI, you can divide it by the cap rate, and you'll get the price. That's pretty simple. It's easy to check too. And when I tell people this, so look at the big number, the little number, and the fraction. Okay, the big number, well, that's probably the price, right? The little number, that's probably the net operating income. And the fraction, meaning a number less than 1, is probably the capitalization rate. Okay, so for instance, we take the NOI and we divide it by the price, right? So that's a little number divided by a big number, right? It's just like normal fractions. If we have 1 divided by 4, that's a fourth, right? Or 0.25. So you see, it yields a decimal number, right? 0.25, a number less than 1. So if we take that same calculation, we have 100,000 divided by a million, we come out with 0.10. What we see is a 10% cap rate, $1 million, sorry, $100,000 in net operating income and $1 million as the target price. So this helps me, because I'm the first Chinese guy you ever met that was bad at math, to just double check my math and say, okay, yeah, I've got the right ones. Because, you know, I get confused too, and I've been doing this for like 35 years. So it's a good thing to just think of and say, okay, I've got my numbers right. Let's go to the next slide, please. So why do we use the cap rate? Well, the big thing that is the differential about the cap rate is that with leased investments, it's much simpler to figure out what your expenses are than it is, let's say, in apartment buildings. Apartment building valuation does often discuss or consider capitalization rate. And you can use industry numbers to figure out what you believe the correct expenses should be for certain types of apartment buildings. However, in reality, each owner of an apartment building will run that building a little bit different. Do you hire a property management company? Do you cut your own grass? Do you clean out the places yourself? When the tenants turn over, do you paint that apartment yourself? Do you hire the most expensive painters in town? All of those things will differentiate one owner from another. And because those things result in a different expense calculation, if you're really cheap and you run your building on a shoestring, your expenses will be lower. If you're busy and you just don't like to do that work yourself, then your expenses are going to be higher. So it's going to affect net operating income, because net operating income is the scheduled gross income minus the expenses and a vacancy rate that are reflected by the income from that building. Okay, so in apartments, usually the tenants pay utilities and the rent, okay? But they don't pay for things like property taxes or maintenance of the property. In leases, tenants may pay some or all or none of those expenses. It all depends on the contract. Okay, so typically, if you're in an office building, and this is not really as true anymore, because you typically, if you're an office building tenant, you pay something that they'll describe as being a load factor. It's a factor where they're going to attribute a certain amount of expense to your space, and you're going to pay that. But it doesn't generally vary from year to year. It's generally the same thing. It's a number they calculate, and that's how much it is. If expenses go up over the coming year, you know, gas prices get really high, and so it becomes very expensive to heat that property, then usually that won't change in an office building. But in a shopping center, you're going to pay what the actual expenses are that are experienced by the landlord. And then typically the landlord will pay that gas price. Each month, you'll be paying the same thing, but at the end of a year, typically, you might have a recalculation of that. You will have a recap what the expenses were, and the landlord may go back to the tenant and say, you owe me more money because your CAM charge, your common area maintenance charge, was lower than it should have. So a cap rate based calculated on net operating income assumes stable lessor operating costs, because really the lessor shouldn't have any operating costs in, let's say, a triple net investment, right? A triple net investment means net of maintenance, operating expenses, and insurance. And so typically that means that if it's a perfect world, the landlord isn't paying for anything, the tenant is paying for everything. And so you can use net operating income and a cap rate for a very stable indicator of value, but it's much harder to do that with apartment buildings because of that difference in management styles. Let's go to the next page. There's an office building, in case you don't know what one looks like. Let's go to the next one. And I think we're going way too fast now. First, we're going nowhere. Now we're going so let's back up.
Back up? Okay.
Back up. And so next slide. Is that right? So okay,
Yes.
I think we just kind of show you what they look like. The shopping center here. The next one is this is an example of a single tenant retail building. It's a Starbucks. Okay, very often they're in standalone buildings. And let's go to the next one. Okay. So I'm going to show you some numbers now. We're going to go through them kind of quickly because they're just illustrations, but they're not based in reality. Okay, because they're very old numbers. I was lazy. I haven't like changed these things to reflect more modern values. And it really doesn't matter. The purpose is just to say, this is what the math is. So let's go on to the next slide. So I don't want to dwell on this too much because it's math. Everybody hates math, but I want you to think about the numbers here and the way they present. So you have the gross potential rent in this example, it's $180,000. You have to use some kind of a vacancy factor because that should be considered when you are trying to derive the net operating income. I used 10% here. Almost nobody would use 10%, even whether it's accurate or not. But I used 10%. We then applied what I call unrecouped expenses, meaning the expenses that the tenants are not paying. Okay, and deducted that from the income less the vacancy factor. And therefore, that yielded the net operating income of $144,000. Again, we do have that math problem. The little number divided by the fractional number, NOI divided by the cap rate, which is assuming a 6% cap rate, which would be very, very high today, in my opinion. And we get the $144,000 divided by 6%, and that gives us the big number, $2.4 million. Okay. So again, pretty straightforward, right? We talked about a fractional number, a little number, and the big number. Big number is the price, the little number is the net operating income, the fractional number, a number less than 1, is the cap rate, because it's expressed as a percentage, right? Let's see the next slide. So, again, just doing simple math manipulation here. If we divide the net operating income by the sales price, right, the little number by the big number, we get the fractional number, the cap rate. So if we have a price of $1.5 million and NOI of 75,000 or 100,000 or 60,000, then next slide, please. It derives these cap rates, 5% or 0.05, 6.7% or 0.067, and 4% or 0.04. Right? Okay. Yeah, it's pretty simple. Okay. If you think about if the cap rate is 10%, that means you're making back 10% of the price every year. Right. And so if it's half of that, if it's 5%, then you're making back 5% of the price every year. Okay. So it's not that complicated. You can kind of eyeball these quickly when you're looking at a number. So let's say it's supposed to be a 4 cap. You know that, well, okay, that income is definitely less than 5% of the price. It's roughly 4% of the price. So, okay, that looks like a 4 cap to me. You can quickly eyeball those numbers. Okay, and I have this kind of trick question, who thinks these are low cap rates? Remember, cap rate is not like an apartment building gross rent multiplier. With an apartment building gross rent multiplier, the higher the number, the more expensive that that investment is. With a cap rate, the higher the number, the cheaper that investment is. Stunning, everybody, deer in the headlights now. It's because what you're doing is you are evaluating the returns of the investor. So in effect, if you buy something and you get a higher return, the price still is the same, right? But it's in effect, it's cheaper to you because you're getting more money back. So, beg your pardon? Well, technically the denominator is the same because this is sale price. Okay, but what I'm saying is that it's like buying a bond. Okay, so people are buying bonds again because interest rates are higher. For 4 or 5 years, interest rates were around 1%. Okay, and maybe even less than that, right? So buying bonds was pointless. But today, your bond returns are back around 5 or 6%. Okay, the price of the bond, the price of the bond changes because when you buy the bond, you buy it at a discounted price, and that's why it's cheap. Right? If you buy a bond at a 6% return, the price you pay for it is cheaper. You're buying the face, you don't pay the face value of the bond. If the bond's for $1,000, you don't pay $1,000, right? You buy it discounted, so it might be $950 or $900, whatever it might be. And so that's why it is, quote, cheaper to you, because it is cheaper, right? Because of that increased return to you, right? So let's go to the next slide. So briefly, let's talk about other valuations. So first of all, sometimes it's a really good question. People say, where do cap rates come? I did this talk, not quite this one. I did a different one for the State Bar, California, with like 300 lawyers in it. And they said, where do cap rates come from? And what they didn't seem to understand was that, well, cap rate is really just reflecting market assumptions, right? So it's like I said, interest rates are going up. So if you go to the bank and you say, I want to park my money in a certificate of deposit, if they say, great, we'll pay you 0.5%, you go, well, wait a minute, interest rates are higher now. I should be getting 3 or 4% CD, right? So the marketplace has spoken. Investor assumes that they're going to get a certain interest rate return on that certificate of deposit. And it's the same thing for cap rates. If you're trying to sell a shopping center at a 1% cap rate, when the market is a 3% cap rate, it's just going to sit there because it's overpriced. So the marketplace gives us the cap rate. Where does the marketplace come from? It comes from everywhere. Everything, everywhere, all at once, right? It is a derivation of market information, what's happening in the real world at any given moment, and what the expectations are for investors in order to get them to act under those circumstances. So, why do we use cap rates? As we talked about a little bit earlier, it gives us a stable analysis, an apples to apples kind of comparison across the investment spectrum. There are other methods of valuations used, which I talked about the last time too, cost per square foot, cost per net rentable square foot. Those are also possible variations. They will tend to help you to corroborate what you understand. For instance, let's say you're looking at an investment and the cap rate appears to represent a market cap rate. And let's say the market is 4%. Okay, so you think, okay, that's good. That's about the market. That makes sense for me to buy. But then you look at the cost per square foot and you find the cost per square foot for that shopping center is $1,000, whereas the other sale comps were $600 per square foot. So the question is like, why is this shopping center so much more expensive on a cost per square foot basis if the cap rate is the same? It might be because the rents are highly exaggerated. For some reason, they tricked a bunch of people to rent that place at a much higher rent per square foot. So it boosted net operating income, creating a deceptively high cap rate on the valuation of that property. Okay, so therefore, that cost per square foot analysis helps you to go back and say, kind of check your math. You know, is there something weird going on here? Is there something unusual? On the other hand, it could be an incredibly successful property, one that's always full and there's a lot of demand. I don't really have one off the top of my head in the San Gabriel Valley. I would say in places like Beverly Hills, okay, which is probably not a very good example, but there might be places like Rodeo Drive, which have a special mystique and a special reputation that causes it to have a kind of exaggerated value where the cost per square foot or the rent per square foot is exceptional. Okay, but that will actually be more likely reflected in the cap rate. That the cap rate will go down. Somebody will pay a great deal for that. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So talking specifically about retail then, we talked about triple net earlier, right? We talked about it means that the landlord is receiving rent net of these expenses, the utilities, the taxes, the management, and the maintenance. There's also something called absolute net, and that's much more common in single tenant buildings like, let's say, I don't want to say Starbucks because they're such a powerful tenant that they probably cut a better deal than that. But let's say it's a Red Lobster or another kind of single tenant, national chain retailer. They may agree to pay for everything. They will maintain the roof themselves. They will paint the building. They will maintain the blacktop. They will take care of all of those things. The landlord doesn't have to absorb anything. A common area maintenance charge, something we talked about earlier, is a very common term called a CAM. It's something you need to know about because that's how we're going to determine whether or not it is a true triple net investment. Are the tenants really paying a CAM charge, which equates the actual operating expenses of the shopping center, and so on. That's then often in a shopping center allocated to the tenants on a per square foot basis. They take the annual operating cost, they divide it by the number of net rentable square feet in the shopping center. They take that and divide it by 12. And they say, this is your responsibility to pay every month. Let's go to the next slide. So office buildings are a little different. A true kind of triple net building, quote unquote, is rare. There is full service gross and modified gross. Full service gross meaning the landlord is paying for everything. Modified gross is a hybrid where some costs are absorbed by the landlord and some costs are paid for by the landlord. Again, I explained this a little bit earlier. Typically, there is sort of a baseline established for that building, that there's certain expenses the landlord's going to ask the tenant to pay for. They are then calculated together, divided by the number of square feet allocated to the tenant, and added onto the rent, and then described in the lease that way. But that usually doesn't change over the life of the lease. So it's not like if the expenses increase or decrease, that the landlord is going to adjust it. Sometimes there's something called an expense stop, where the landlord says, I will pay for this and go on and based on our original deal. But if there is an expense which goes up beyond this point, then I have the right to pass this. Let's go on to the next one. Very quickly, because we're running out of time. Remember that in lease transactions, you've got a number of levels of different things that need to be done for due diligence. First, the leases themselves have to be analyzed. And by the way, you should not really be doing any of this due diligence. Even lawyers don't like to do due diligence unless they're being paid to do the due diligence. Because it's fraught with peril and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. Unless you really know what you're doing, you should be doing it. You should be leaving your client to do the due diligence. There are estoppel certificates which have to be agreed upon. They have to be issued. The tenants have to execute them. They have to come back. As I said a little bit earlier, loan standards tend to be, loan documents tend to be less standardized. There's financial review and things like that, which are probably well beyond the qualifications of anybody in this room, including myself, to do. You don't really want to be breaking out your calculator and counting up the income expense numbers. Those are things which you need to know about and your client needs to know about, because you need to establish that the actual representation, this return at this cap rate, that it's accurate and based on the numbers that the seller releases to you. And very often they are not. So there are a lot of places where there's a lot of stuff to do here in the due diligence phase of the purchase. And I would urge all of you not to do them unless it's very clear that you're qualified to do it, that you're going to get paid to do it. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I just addressed this a moment ago. Basically, I'm going to move through it quickly. Do the rents conform to the representations? That's the most important. Are there other aspects of the lease that are problematic? Are there limits on the increases in the rent, the COLAs, the cost of living adjustment? Are the tenants solvent? Are they behind today? Do they have a shoddy rent payment history? Are they going under? Are there, kind of trapdoors in the leases where, you've got what looks like a 5-year lease with the tenant, but it says, well, after 2 years, if I want to, I can give the landlord notice and I can terminate the lease with 60 days notice. Those things, those kinds of provisions exist in commercial leases. And somebody needs to go through them to make sure that they're not in the documents, or at least that they're not a surprise to you when you purchase that shopping center. And are the CAMs actually being collected? Often that's the place where a tenant, when they're going bad, they'll pay the base rent, but they'll stop paying the CAM charges. And so now you're not talking about triple net anymore. Let's go on to the next one. Estoppel certificates are a major pain in the butt. They come up at the end of the transaction invariably. Tenants hate them and don't understand them. They're scary looking things that look legal because they are. And they just won't sign them or return them. So for any of you who've done a commercial transaction, you know that this is a frightening thing because it's in between you and a paycheck. And so there's something you need to think about. You need to be prepared for it when you make the deal, that you have an estoppel agreement that the seller will provide estoppels. The estoppel certificate, so the doctrine of estoppel is the idea that when somebody agrees to something, they can't go against it, they are estopped. And so the estoppel certificate is usually a one-page document, it might be 2 or longer, but usually 1 or 2. It's placed on top of the commercial lease. And the tenant says, yes, this is my lease. It is valid. It is correct. I don't have any defenses to it. The landlord doesn't owe me anything other than what's said in the lease. I'm not behind on my rent. And I acknowledge that this lease is a true, bona fide, genuine copy. Okay. And some other things too. But those things are important, because if your client buys a shopping center and finds out that all the tenants say, oh no, there was an amendment last year and the landlord dropped all the rents to half the value that was in the lease, you need to know about that, because you've got a very big problem in that shopping center. And so this is supposed to help you to avoid it. Okay? And the lender is going to require it in order for the lender to fund. So this is a problem, something that you want to be out in front of before you get there. Next slide, please. A SINDA, a subordination, non-disturbance, and attornment agreement, is a complicated document. Again, it's scary looking, but basically what it says is it's in a transaction where there's a lender The lender says, if I foreclose, tenant, you agreed you will attorn to me. You will become my tenant or my successor's tenant or anybody I designate. You agree you will continue to honor the lease, whether or not the seller is still your landlord. And you will agree to be obligated to me or to the person I designate. Okay, and in exchange for that, I will agree to honor your lease and allow you to stay. Otherwise, the act of that the lender doing the foreclosure could theoretically extinguish that lease. Let's go to the next. They're kind of complicated documents and people don't like them again. So if you want something you want to be aware of. Much like this softball. Loan docs come out, within 1 or 2 days. They are different from lender to lender. There's a very short time to review them. This is a problem when you're facing pressure from the 1031 exchange. Probably most of you are familiar with something called the Internal Revenue Code Section 1031 exchange. It is the like-kind tax deferred exchange. And most commercial transactions are driven by the 1031. So you are often facing a time schedule crunch at the end of a transaction. And so you've got to be careful for all these things that are coming along that could cause delays in the transaction. And the negotiability of those loan documents is variable. Let's go to the next slide. Briefly, sometimes they want borrower opinion letters. This is a thing that lawyers hate to sign. We always take them a water them down, but basically they're telling, the bank is telling the buyer to agree that they don't have any defenses to the bank's loan enforcement. And they typically want the buyer's lawyers to sign. Next page, please. And there's some things about corporate standing, things like that. These are all part of that buyer opinion letter. Let's go to the next page, please. Okay. So that is a super quick and dirty overview of commercial transactions, right? A lot of information in there, but I think we did hit all the high points. We talked about the different types of real estate investments. We talked about valuation methods based on income. And we talked about the difference between, let's say, apartment buildings and lease investments. And we talked about some special issues in those transactions, as well as the role of counsel, which are the people who are going to be helping you with sometimes the due diligence, certainly things like the estoppel certificates, the loan documents, and the analysis of the leases. I think that's it. The next page is just my phone number if you need it. Are there any questions?
Yeah, there's a few questions on the Zoom chat box.
I don't talk to anybody on Zoom because you come here, you snooze, you lose.
So I'm just gonna fire away.
All right.
All right, thank you so much, David. The question we have here is from Johnson Lynn. How is the commercial outlook going forward, especially office and retail shopping centers?
Hi, Johnson. I remember you. Well, I would describe it as cloudy. That's what we see today. Office tenancies in some markets are still very stable. In some large markets, it's very bad. Midtown Manhattan, San Francisco, office markets are in a lot of trouble. San Francisco was already kind of a strange market because what you saw was from the 2000s going forward, that dot-coms, when they went through their rapid expansion, they were controlling very large swaths of office space in high-rise office buildings in San Francisco, because a dot-com startup could start up with 5,000 square feet, go to 100,000 square feet, go to 300,000 square feet, and then go bankrupt. Okay, so what was that? They could do all that within 2 years. So what they started to do was, because they had all this money being generated by investors, is they were controlling very large amounts of square footage in downtown San Francisco, because they were trying to anticipate a rapid growth pattern. They'd be more frustrated by not having square footage of office space available to them. What that unfortunately presented, though, was the fact that you had this fake occupancy level in San Francisco. And there was something like 2 million square feet of office square footage in San Francisco, which was technically rented, but actually vacant. It was seated. And so it has been a problem really for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years now. I forget how many. And one which San Francisco is still wrestling with. It's gotten much worse, of course, today because of COVID and the realization that, people don't actually need to go to the office. So we live in uncertain times. I used to talk about the Amazon effect and the fact that that was driving out a lot of retailers, especially small retailers. We have seen that come full circle, where retail was in a lot of trouble before the pandemic. In some respects, Amazon accelerated that into the pandemic. And we had this kind of explosion of retail activity because people said, hey, we can go back outside again. And they wanted to get out and get into the stores. But we still are finding a way to repurpose some of that space and figure out what it means to have retail anymore. That there have been a lot of different approaches. One of them was to say that, and actually the Westfield people before they sold it, not this, the Westfield corporate, Santa Anita, but Santa Anita is a good example. One theory was we're going to use the shopping center as a showroom, and people will come to that shopping center and see products they want, and then either buy it online or at satellite retail locations. Well, that's great, but how does the landlord charge rent for you? Because if there are no sales in that shopping center, how do I convince my tenants to pay top dollar to rent space from me in Century City or in Santa Anita? It's based on hope. It's based on surmise that that's how that system is working. It's a really tough question. So, we've seen, and you see this a lot in Santa Anita, is the rise of a lot of restaurant tenants in Santa Anita and other service tenants. I used to tell people, if you're going to rent retail, make sure you rent it to somebody who is selling something that Amazon can't give you. Okay. And since Amazon's even delivering groceries at this point, that is a really tricky kind of analysis. And actually, by the way, Amazon, that's a place where they have failed. They purchased Whole Foods, not failed, but they're not doing well with the sale of groceries. So, and the Amazon folks, they're kind of smart. They're a lot smarter than me, at least, and probably most of the people in this room. So, it's a really good question about what's going on out there and how scary is it. And I don't think we really have any answers. Certainly, I don't. I used to think I had some, but not so much anymore. Next one.
This will probably be the last question. What about the marketplace on the statewide side? You given us a handful of examples from what's going on in the state, but how about nationwide? Kind of give us a little of your advice on that.
I was subscribing to a national newsletter, but it was too much. I was getting like a dozen emails a day, and I thought I'm already getting spammed to death from other stuff. So the answer is really hard to say, because market to market is different. And so, what we know is that we're in a higher interest rate market. We know that institutional investors are still purchasing real estate. And so they've been supporting that a great deal. And that's gone on now for at least 10 years, if not longer. So, will that end? No, I don't think so. But there's certainly some frightening stuff going on nationally, in a lot of major markets in terms of, again, downtown core, places where people have not gone back to work, and the ripple effect from that, because in Midtown Manhattan, when only 40% of the office market has returned to work, that means the falafel guy on the corner with a hand truck, the donut people, the Starbucks, the nail salons, selling beauty services to the workers in those buildings, they all suffer from it. And unfortunately, this goes hand in hand with the rise of the homeless problem, which is plaguing our country today, and especially in downtown, major market areas, because when folks stop coming to work, folks who don't work anymore have a place to hang out. So these are all huge problems that we're still wrestling with. And unfortunately, nobody has an answer. Mr. Lee, what do you want?
I have a different on some of this.
Oh, you're standing up for that. That's good. Thank you.
Some of this OM that were written by the CTIMs. When they're trying to entice the potential buyers on buying a particular piece of commercial property beside the commercial investments. What do you think about the performance? My bias is that it's a little bit an exaggerated piece on, how does I say it? Inflating the property value so they can get higher cap rates. But I wouldn't see your opinion. Maybe I'm biased because I've seen
I
hundreds.
think that, isn't that the ego theory? Garbage in, garbage out. You know, a pro forma is basically a fancy word for a projection.
Yeah.
Or two fancy words. So what does it mean? I mean, if you're saying, okay, I have signed leases from tenants who are performing today. And that lease says next year, the rents will be this much, and next year the rents will be that much. Then yeah, that's fine, because assuming again that those tenants are healthy, assuming that they are engaged in businesses which are not under a lot of pressure, assuming that they will continue to enjoy the patronage of their customers, what's called goodwill, right? Then those numbers are pretty solid, right? You know, if you have and we all know them, some small shopping centers or medium-sized centers where it looks like the tenants are very stable, they've been there a long time, and they've got some good business, then that pro forma is great. You know, or you have some idea that it will continue to perform along the lines of what's described in that pro forma. If on the other hand, it's a vacant shopping center, and they say, well, we expect absorption at 35% every 4 months, and that therefore in a year and a half, this will be full, and then rents will be this. Well, that's just guesswork. Nobody knows that that's actually going to happen. Okay, and that is a big problem. So it's you can't leave your common sense at the door. Jeff, anything else?
That'll be all. That wraps up our Q&A
Thank you very much,
session.
everybody.
So let's give Mr. David Fu a warm applause of our appreciation. And let's see, want to make sure on behalf of West Anglian Valley Realtors, we'd like to thank Mr. David Fu for being our guest speaker and for your very informative presentation. I want to present you a small token of our appreciation with the certificate.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. I hope you had a good nap.
Oh, that was awesome. I was sleeping, I was awake.
Let's get the coffee. So
Yes, 2 cups of coffee was the trick. We miss everyone on Zoom, and I hope you can join us in person for snacks and coffee with a quick networking with our guest speaker and a group photo. We have an amazing lineup of useful and interesting upcoming classes. On June 14th, the CRMLS virtual training, Matrix Managing Listing. On June 16th, we have a 45-hour DRE license renewal continuing education. On June 20th, we have a meet and learn, winning strategy and purchasing a home with a reverse mortgage. Lastly, I wanted to put a quick emphasis on a class that we'll be having, CCIM class 102 on July 24th to 27th. It's a 4-day full class. We'll learn a ton about the commercial real estate, and we look forward to seeing you there. Until next time, thank you, everyone. Bye.